Hello, everyone. Larry DuBois here again, and we are in our continuing study in the book of Acts. And this episode is number 44, and it is chapter 23, and Lord willing, we'll be able to go through the entire chapter. We also have a little bit of a review we'll do first. I've entitled this episode, Paul's Testimony Divides a Council. Because as we start off, you'll see as he testifies before the Jewish council, he's brought there and he figures out that some of them are Pharisees and some are Sadducees. And so we're going to look at that, and then we're going to see Paul being transported under a great armored guard down to Caesarea from Jerusalem after a plot is revealed by his nephew and has been told to the commander. Well, we'll look at that and we'll review last week just a bit. The picture that you see behind me, the background picture, is a painting from the city of Jerusalem. It's a road that leads into Jerusalem. I try to find one that went from Jerusalem to Caesarea in Bible times. This is the closest I could find. And then we'll have a couple of other diagrams as we go along. In my notes, I got a map as well, so we'll take a look at that. So let's see here. Let's go ahead and go over here to the slideshow. And as we review chapter 22, basically it was a couple of times where the commander of the Roman garrison there in the city of Jerusalem had to rescue Paul. He was arrested in the city of Jerusalem there, and he gave his defense. That was in chapter 21. Then in chapter 22, he gave his defense before the mob from the stairs. He asked the commander if he could speak to the crowd as he was being brought into the barracks there to be further interrogated. And once the commander found out he spoke in Hebrew, he allowed him to speak to the crowd, and he basically started sharing his testimony until he got to that one word, and that was that the Lord had told him to go to the Gentiles. And of course the crowd went nuts, and they wanted to rip him apart, and they were yelling out, this man isn't fit to live. And so we picked the story up where the commander again takes him into the barracks, and he was going to scourge him, and finds out he's a Roman citizen. But then the next day he decides he's going to bring him down. When things got calmed down a little bit, he's going to take him down before this Jewish council, and that's where the story picks up. So as a way of introduction, I got the bullet points there. It broke down in little sections of scripture that we'll go ahead and read, but I got Paul before the high priest, and then he divides the council with what he says. He's assured by Jesus. There's a little short interruption there. The Lord comes to Paul, I guess, in a vision. Men bind themselves with an oath to kill Paul. Then the assassination plot is revealed. The plan to transport Paul safely, the letter to Felix from the commander, and then Paul arrives safely and awaits his accusers. And that's pretty much an outline of chapter 23. So let's see here. So Paul before the high priest, I'll go ahead and read the first 5 verses here. And by all means, if you have your Bible, follow along if you will. You can always read these notes. We've already prayed, and so we're ready to dig in. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, Do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, because I'm doing this one on slides here, I got the next slide in my little commentary. When this incident happens where he's talking to this high priest, and whatever he says aggravates him, and he commands the guy to be slapped. Now, in Paul's case, it doesn't look like the guy slapped him. In fact, when they made a movie, they show Paul, holding his hand out and stopping the guy from actually striking him. It's really not perfectly clear there. But a similar thing happens in John 18, and that's Jesus before Annas, the high priest. Now, this is a different high priest. Annas was a different high priest, and actually he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was technically the high priest. They had both been high priests during the time of Jesus. That's why a lot of times they'll list them both as being high priest. Basically, the Ananias, the father-in-law, he was forced, or Annas, excuse me, he was forced out of office, as history dictates there, and Caiaphas took over. So a lot of the Jews recognize the father-in-law being the elder statesman and all, still being the high priest. So a lot of times in the text there, as you go through the Gospels, it'll list him as the high priest. But they took Jesus in John 18, verses 23 and 23 there, and when he had, I'll read it, when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" And Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why do you strike me? Well, it was an interesting situation there. We know Jesus never sinned, and he had full right to say that. It was basically saying, look, if I've spoken out of turn, let me know what it is. Otherwise, why are you hitting me? Is out of order. Well, at that, in the text there in John 18, if you read that whole chapter, you're going to find that Annas then, that was it for him. He wasn't going to get anywhere with Jesus, so he sent him over to Caiaphas there, the true high priest. But they examined him at night, very unofficial, impromptu meeting, basically trying to railroad Jesus. And they were doing the same thing here to Paul. This other guy, this Ananias, spelled a little different there. This was a high priest, was notorious for being one of the crueler ones. Very cruel. So I got there in my bullet point. A different high priest, he was cruelest. Paul didn't know him. Now, you would think that how would Paul not know him? Well, we could take it at face value. Some commentators think that he's just being smart aleck. Like, oh, I didn't know he was a high priest, that sort of thing. If we take it at face value, it's very possible that Paul, being gone for a long time, he had never seen this guy in person. He had taken over after Paul had, after his conversion. But he didn't realize, and it was an unofficial meeting at this point. You got to remember, so they weren't in their official robes and that, which would have distinctively shown who the high priest was if it would have been an official meeting. So I put down Paul didn't really know him. And what he says is, let's see if we go back to that. Paul says in verse 5, he realizes his mistake, and he repents, and he says, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And that is taken out of Exodus 22:28. So we got a couple of good little lessons there. In the heat of the moment, if you're standing before a council, if you're standing before maybe a group at work, maybe they're going to scrutinize on you. And of course, as it pertains to witnessing for Christ, I would think that's the best application, but it could be for some other reason. Of course, you want to keep your wits about you, but even if it's a little heated, be prepared if you're wrong to go ahead and admit that. Of course, before God, it's the honorable thing to do, but it can actually go a long way before even your accusers if you're willing to admit when you were wrong. And so then he retracts basically what he said, and then he quotes that out of the law in Exodus there, that you should not speak evil of a rule of your people. And this we could do well, especially right now. I remember a couple presidencies ago, the conservative people, the Christians, they didn't care for the president, so they'd make snide remarks, and they would actually speak evil. I think it tells us in Titus not to speak evil of anyone, and particularly these leaders. We should be praying for them, and the president we have in there now, if you're not in the United States, President Biden, whatever he's done and how bad ever he is, we shouldn't be speaking evil of him. We should be praying for him, and I hear Christians speak evil of him all the time. And maybe there's some validity to that, but I don't think that's how we should behave. And there's a good verse for us. Okay, so if we go on, moving on in verse 6 there, I'll read verse 6 through 10. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Now when there rose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him back into the barracks. And so this is like, I think, the third time he's rescued. Now Paul makes a bold move here. Perhaps he saw that when he wasn't going to do too favorably right off the bat, he has an issue with the high priest, or the high priest has an issue with him. He realizes he's not going to have much of a fair trial, if you will. So he makes a bold move and causes a dissension among the council there. And so what happened, it says right there in the text, the reason for the dissension was the fact that the Sadducees, if you remember in the Gospels, they didn't believe in the resurrection. And they tried to trip Jesus up in this, and they were trying to show from the law that, it never talked about any resurrection. And Jesus, who had said, speaking of the resurrection of the dead, he said that God said, I am the God of Abraham, I am the God of Isaac, I'm the God of Jacob. And so God is the God of the living, not of the dead. And he kind of put them to silent. Okay, so he then, in verse 11, this stands out, this next verse there. But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. And so this was an assurance to him that he was not going to lose his life in any of these ruckuses and these riots. He wasn't going to be held back in Jerusalem forever. He was going to appear in Rome and bear witness to authorities. And going back to his original conversion, the Lord said he would speak before the people, the Gentiles, the people of Israel, the children of Israel, before kings and rulers and authority. So he had opportunity. Well, the Lord's way of doing this was having him arrested and having him transferred around through these different agencies, if you will, different jurisdictions of confinement and of arrests and trials and that sort of thing. So he was going to bear witness in Rome. Now, I was thinking about this. I've met a lot of people over the years that have claimed that Jesus appeared to them, in a dream maybe, or a vision. And sometimes what they go on and the story gets so outlandish, it's hard to believe that Jesus appeared to them and said these things to them. And if it was perhaps an angel of light. Now, we have to determine, does the Lord still speak to people that way today? And I would say for the most part, no. Now, the Lord can do anything he wants. So the question isn't, could he? The question should be, does he? We know he could. He could appear and sit right next to me right this second, like he did Paul. if he wanted to. But the Lord has an agenda. He has a protocol. He has things, and we believe that the apostles had these great encounters with Jesus in Revelations. Paul, who was not an original apostle, but he had these encounters with Jesus throughout his ministry, where the Lord spoke directly to him, just like he spoke to Moses, and tells us that in these last days, in the book of Hebrews, it says, in these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son. And so the best way we can get direction, we can get the Lord to speak to us, is reading his word. And there we can stake our life on that. If we have a dream or a vision, and a lot of times those things are very subjective and what we feel the Lord might be telling us, if you will. So anyway, let's go ahead and move on. Starting at verse 12, this subtitle I put, Men Vow to Kill Paul. Now, it says, when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat or drink until they had killed Paul. Now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They had come to the chief priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we've killed Paul. Now you, therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him, but we are ready to kill him before he comes near. So basically, there's 40 of them, okay? So that's a lot of guys that were very zealous. They were determined to make this very strong vow of not eating or drinking anything until they killed Paul. And they were suggesting that these leaders go and basically set him up. Say, look, we want to talk to Paul, think it's all legit. We want to talk to him more fully. And could you bring him down to Caesarea there and whatnot, and to make further inquiry. But what they were going to do was they were going to wait along the way and ambush him and kill Paul. Because normally they would have probably just been escorted Paul, not thinking he was a threat to escape. They probably would have assigned a couple soldiers as all, and these guys could have easily have overpowered them and killed Paul. And so that was the plot. So there was 40 of them. They wouldn't eat and drink. It's interesting if you look through the Bible, New Testament and Old actually. I think the most common fast you'll find is going 3 days and 3 nights, so a total of 3 days without eating or drinking. You'll find that this is the most common. And so just a side note on that, it's a very, when you say, I'm not going to eat anything until, whatever you're vowing, you could really put yourself out on a limb there, because these guys did. Obviously, they couldn't fulfill their vow. Their oath, it meant, because they never got to kill Paul. So, after you can't eat for, 10 years go by and you still haven't accomplished it, at that point, you'd be dead, so you couldn't, you have to be very wise. And I think that if we feel strongly about something, I think there's a good precedent in the New Testament. Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. James, in the book of James, also reaffirms this concept that we're not to make any oaths or make any vows like they did in the Old Testament, but let your yes be yes and your no, no. And the reason is because we can utter a vow that later we think, why did I say that? In the heat of the moment, I was very zealous for this thing. And if we were to say something like, I'm not going to eat or drink until my mother-in-law saved, or something like this, and then we pray and we fast, and how long can we last? 40 days at the very most, I think, is Moses was able to fast 40 days and 40 nights. But besides the fast, just in general, making an oath, I don't think it's good to do that in the New Testament. Okay. The assassination plot is revealed to Paul's nephew, verse 16 there. So when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you." Then the commander took him by the hand, went aside, and asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither eat nor drink until they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." All right, so let's see what I have down here in my notes. So Paul's nephew, he overhears about the ambush. He tells Paul, who in turn tells the guard. The guard takes him to the commander. The commander takes the report very seriously. And so going back to our text there, of course, you're going to believe that God's divine sovereignty intervention is how his nephew happens to hear this. And it because if he hadn't of, then, of course, it wasn't going to be ordained Paul get killed at that time, but that is how the Lord thwarted their plans, is this young man. Now, I always thought when I first read this, what's his sister and his nephew doing there? Paul's a world traveler. He goes all over, and all of a sudden now they're there. That's kind of weird. But then the more I thought about it, they are in Jerusalem, and that's kind of hub central for a lot of things. Perhaps they lived in Jerusalem there. And Paul, at many times when he was arrested, he had the freedom to have visitors come and provide for him, because he wasn't a murderer or some sort of, a notorious criminal, dangerous criminal. He was just more or less a political prisoner. And they trusted him that, he wasn't going to escape or anything like that. So a lot of times he let them see his friends. So it wouldn't have been uncommon for his sister to have been visiting him, or his nephew. His nephew must have been a younger man. I don't know how young, but it says the guy took him by the hand. So it sounds like he was kind of like a little kid. So for the commander to trust his testimony that he heard this, that's something too, right? And that he believed the kid. The fact that the prisoner, that Paul said, "Hey, take this young man to go speak to the commander," that the prisoner didn't say, "I'm not going to listen to you. I don't want to." So that the prisoner don't get a lot of rights, generally. So that, they could have easily said, "We're not going to listen to you. I'm not going to take this kid. What does he have to say?" But everything fell in order. And again, I believe it's God's providence to be able to intervene here and expose this for what it was. And it never came to pass, their plans. So the moral of the story there is to trust the Lord. So they were waiting for him to make a decision. And so that's what we're going to see next here now. The plan to transport Paul safely. In verse 23, he called for 2 centurions. A centurion was a soldier that was in all likelihood in charge of 100 people, 100 soldiers. That's where we get the word century. It means 100. So a centurion, if you're to be a centurion, that was a pretty good position. You were in charge of 100 soldiers. And there was a lot of centurions mentioned in the New Testament there, in the Gospels, as well as throughout the book of Acts. And so he called for 2 centurions and said, "Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor." So this is quite an entourage. This is quite a protective group for Paul. He probably could have, there's 40 of them. The guy knew there'd be 40, maybe he figured there might be a few more than 40. He could have just asked for 50 guys or, whatever. He could have asked for 100, but 200 soldiers, so he had 200 probably soldiers that were on foot, and then 70 more that were on horses, and then 200 that carried spears. So a total of 475 guys just to escort Paul from Jerusalem down to Caesarea, which is about 70 miles, at least on today's roads. I think as a crow flies, direct thing, if you look at a map, it's 70 miles roughly. But it was the third hour of the night, so this would have been in the middle of the night, so he was going to perhaps use strategy here to outwit the guys that were waiting along the road to ambush. They were going to leave in the middle of the night, and the 40 guys that were expected to cause him trouble probably weren't going to be prepared at that time, and they would have been prepared for him to leave in the morning at daybreak. Then it says provide mounts to set Paul on. That basically is just provide a horse, saddle, all the things that Paul would need to saddle up and ride along with him. And of course, their goal was to bring him safely to Felix the governor. So this commander, who had already rescued Paul twice, doesn't hesitate to order enough escort for Paul. Now this could have had something to do with the reason he realized there was all these people against Paul. And he probably thought, no, we better make sure we better get enough soldiers, enough guys down there to take care of anything, because I don't want them to die on my watch. Or, maybe he found favor with this commander that he felt sorry for Paul or something. All right, moving on. The letter to Felix from the commander, verse 25. He wrote a letter in the following manner: Claudius Lysias, so there's the guy's name, to the most excellent governor Felix. Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, and the next day they left the horsemen to go on with them and return to the barracks. So he sends a letter along with Paul and these soldiers and that, explaining what the situation is. And their letters, the form of their letters are different than what we're used to now. How we usually write a letter now, or what I'm used to since as a kid. I live here in America, so we write a letter. We'd say, dear Uncle Chuck, and then I would write all the stuff I wanted to write, and then at the end I'd sign, your nephew Larry, or love Larry, or whatever. Now, it would come in an envelope, so initially whoever you're sending a letter to is going to know whose it's from before they read it. It's not like they got to read it. Although we do put our signature at the end, it's not like they have to read the whole thing to figure out whose it's from. But in their day, which I liked is how they did it, and business letters can be this way too. They state who it's from, who is it to, and what it's about in a little paragraph, so and then you read the content of it. So anyway, he explains the situation to this Felix. And so they leave and they take Paul to Antipatris. Now, Antipatris was a city that was on the way. It was a Roman city that it had a tower. It was dedicated. It had lots of Roman soldiers. It was basically an outpost. And I think it was built by Herod. But that there is a picture of the ruins of part of this center in Antipatris. It was basically a military post, if you will. And so that's a good picture of that. You could find out more about it on the internet yourself if you'd like. Here's a map now that I found. It was hard to find this, believe it or not. You'd think it'd be pretty easy, but to get the exact map that goes from Jerusalem to Caesarea, which is downhill. Jerusalem was, up on a hill. And so a lot of times, normally we would say, when we go north, we would say we're going up to a city. And then if it was a city south of us, we'd say we're going down. Sometimes if the city was higher in elevation, even though they were going north, they might say we're going down to Caesarea. Or if you were in Caesarea coming back, you'd say we're going up to Jerusalem. There's a psalm that says, and they made a song about it. It actually says, I forget what psalm it is. I just thought of it now. But it says, part of the psalm, it goes, beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. Is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. Great is our God. Okay, so that's the song. They take it out of the Psalms. Some versions say beautiful in situation, but the text says beautiful in elevation. It was higher. It's high up on a higher plane. So it looks like, so they got 26 miles and 38 miles, which is roughly, 14 and 1, 64 miles, something like that. Going on horseback might have been different than driving a car, obviously. So you can see where Antipatris there is on the way. And there was an outpost there of soldiers. So that's it on the map. Our last few verses of the chapter, when they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he had asked that what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Caesarea, if I'm pronouncing that right, Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's Praetorium. Okay, so this Felix, the governor, he was sort of, we're going to learn in the next chapter, he wasn't real favorable towards Paul, though he wasn't a real enemy either. He was just sort of somewhere in between. But he wasn't going to do Paul tons of favors. It sounded like this commander Paul had a lot more favor with, this Lysias that sent him down there. Now, I don't know what providence had to do with anything else as far as his trial or his incarceration there. Maybe he was just curious. He wanted to know what province he was from, what province of the Roman Empire was he from. So he was from Tarsus, a city, and the city was in this province of Sicilia. So anyway, he says, well, I'm going to hear your case when the accusers get down here. So he commanded him to be kept in Herod's Praetorium. And basically I just stated all those things I had down as bullet points. I was looking for this last picture there. That's a diagram, drawing, I think it is, of Herod's Praetorium there in the city of Caesarea. And this was built as a vacation spot, perhaps. But he was, remember in the Gospels when Luke's Gospel gives the account of King Herod involving himself with the trial of Jesus. And it was actually Pilate who, it said when he found out he was in, his jurisdiction was Galilee, that he was in Herod's jurisdiction, he said he knew that Herod was in Jerusalem at the time, so he sent him over to Herod. Well, why is that important? Well, because Herod normally didn't reside in Jerusalem. He resided in Caesarea. He just so happened to be in Jerusalem at the time, so Pilate could conveniently send him over there for a part of the afternoon, hoping that Herod was going to take this prisoner, this difficult prisoner, that Pilate didn't have to deal with him anymore, and Herod would have to deal with him. But as it stood, Herod didn't find any fault in him, but he sent him back to Pilate, so Pilate was stuck with him again. But that story is found in the book of Luke, chapter 23 there, and so you won't find that encounter in the other Gospels. That Luke includes it. But anyway, this is where he was staying. Normally, is in the city of Caesarea, and then he would come up to Jerusalem during certain times. Pilate being the governor, of course, of Jerusalem. Well, anyway, my friends, that does it for this week. I try to do these once a week. The book of Acts, and finishing up chapter 3. Next week, we head into chapter 24. And I hope you join us in. In the meantime, go ahead and look at the past books that we've done if you haven't. And like I always say, maybe you see something in the text that we didn't bring out. By all means, drop me a line. Get a hold of me if you'd like concerning that. And until we meet again, God bless you. And the Lord be with you. Bye-bye.